Brookstone Oaks was a modest, tree-lined suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of a mid-sized city in the United States. Visitors were often enchanted by its manicured lawns, freshly painted shutters, and neat driveways, like a picture from a real estate brochure. Dogs barked in the distance, kids played with bikes and chalk on the sidewalks, and in the evenings, residents strolled leisurely with their pets. On the surface, life seemed peaceful. Yet underneath the calm facade, a subtle tension brewed. Homeowners in Brookstone Oaks paid monthly dues to the local HOA, an organization founded with the noble intention of preserving the neighborhood's aesthetic and property values. Over the years, however, these rules had become labyrinthine. Complaints about mailbox styles or fence heights turned neighbors into adversaries. A pink flamingo ornament, a stray basketball hoop, or a non-approved exterior paint color could ignite more ire than one would imagine. No one, however, embodied the HOA's most extreme tendencies more than Bernice Arnold, often called Karen by her neighbors, a nickname that circulated half in jest, half in exasperation. Bernice was in her late 40s and served as the HOA secretary. She had lived in Brookstone Oaks for about 5 years and, upon arriving, seemed friendly enough, baking cookies for neighbors, organizing a small holiday get-together. Gradually, she revealed herself to be a forceful presence, employing the HOA rules like a personal scepter. Whether it was yard gnomes or holiday lights, she had opinions, and she enforced them relentlessly. Residents whispered that she was trying to transform Brookstone Oaks into her own version of a minimalist paradise. No eclectic decor, no clashing paint colors, no personal flourishes. She saw every plastic lawn flamingo as a heinous sin against design, every whimsical wind chime as a violation of the quiet enjoyment clause, and every bright door as a visual disruption. At first, people simply rolled their eyes. But as time went on, her actions became more brazen, culminating in an outrageous deed that would shake the neighborhood to its core: the removal of an elderly resident's porch handrail. Outside of HOA matters, Bernice, Karen, was not particularly social. She rarely invited anyone into her home. An immaculate house with pale beige siding, black shutters, and a polished metal number plaque. The interior, if rumors were to be believed, was equally sparse. No family photos on the walls, a glass coffee table in an otherwise empty living room, and every piece of furniture following a strict modern aesthetic. Despite her aloof nature, she was on a first-name basis with every board member and boasted that she alone had read the entire 150-page Brookstone Oaks HOA covenant. Her personal folder, emblazoned with the HOA logo, was stuffed with forms, violation notices, and dog-eared pages of bylaws. She carried it everywhere, as though it were a protective shield. Some neighbors speculated that Karen's devotion to the HOA was about control. Perhaps in her personal life, she felt powerless. Others guessed she took genuine pride in beautifying the neighborhood, though many strongly disagreed with her interpretation of beauty. Regardless of motive, her single-minded zeal for code enforcement created a culture of fear. People would scramble to hide holiday decorations before the date mandated by the guidelines, or ensure their garbage bins were retrieved from the curb within the HOA's strictly allotted window. This tension might have remained a dull hum if not for a series of small conflicts that gradually escalated. It started with polite notices pinned to doors, then sternly worded letters threatening fines. After the first year, Karen had effectively become the face, and sometimes the fist, of the Brookstone Oaks HOA. In a cozy, single-story home at the far end of the cul-de-sac lived Margaret Langley, a 72-year-old widow. She had moved into Brookstone Oaks decades earlier, back when the community was simpler. Her late husband, Robert, had been a carpenter who built their front porch by hand, crafting wide wooden steps and a sturdy wooden railing for Margaret's safety. Even after he passed away, Margaret maintained their home meticulously, albeit in a modest style. She wasn't one for bold paint colors or flashy art decor. Her porch was adorned with a few potted begonias and a simple rocking chair on which she sipped her morning coffee. She used to greet neighbors warmly, but in recent years, she'd become more reclusive, partly from her grief, partly because of a changing neighborhood dynamic. Margaret had heard stories of Karen's relentless enforcement, but she had never personally felt the brunt of it. Her house complied with most of the rules: neutral paint, discreet garbage storage, no extraneous front yard decorations. In fact, Karen rarely found fault with Margaret's property until she decided that the older woman's porch railing didn't meet her vision of neighborhood uniformity. It began quietly. One day, Karen was seen pacing around Margaret's driveway, scribbling in her ever-present notebook. Observing from her front window, Margaret felt uneasy. Karen ran a palm over the white wooden railing, stooped to examine the screws, and tapped a manicured fingernail on the post. She left without a word, but Margaret could sense that this would not be the last time. Sure enough, Margaret received a call from Karen a few days later. "Ms. Langley, good afternoon," Karen began, feigning warmth. "As secretary of the HOA, I'm required to perform periodic checks. I notice your railing might not be in strict compliance with the recommended guidelines for exterior aesthetics." Margaret held the receiver, confused. "I'm sorry, but this railing has been here for over 30 years. My husband built it. I was never informed it was a problem." Karen's voice tightened. "I understand it has sentimental value. However, the neighborhood is moving toward a more minimalist exterior style, and a large wooden handrail can appear dated. We'd prefer sleeker lines, metal, or possibly a refined vinyl. I'm sure we can find an alternative that satisfies both safety and aesthetic requirements." "I'll consider it," Margaret said gently, not wanting to quarrel. She felt uneasy after hanging up. The notion of removing something Robert had built with such care left a pit in her stomach. For a while, Karen let the subject drop. Margaret hoped the call was merely a minor suggestion that would fade away. Yet the seeds of discontent had been planted. At the next HOA meeting, the question of uniform aesthetics came up. Karen delivered a prepared statement about how a consistent style boosted property values. She pointed to a slideshow with pictures of modern, angular porch designs. Most members listened politely, but seemed more worried about real concerns, like the pothole near the entrance to the development or the broken street lamp on Maple Drive. When Karen finished, a new couple, the Johanssons, raised their hands to question the logic of forcing everyone into the same style. "Isn't part of what makes Brookstone Oaks charming the individuality of each home?" asked Mr. Johansson. Karen stared coldly. "Individual expression can be achieved through lawn art and subtle differences in color. But large-scale deviations from recommended guidelines, like an oversized wooden railing, can appear unsightly. We want the best for the community." She offered no names, but the glances in her direction made it obvious. Everyone understood she was talking about Margaret's railing. Margaret herself hadn't attended that HOA meeting, so she remained unaware of how pointedly Karen had singled her out. Meanwhile, other residents exchanged worried looks. None eager to see the neighborhood turned into a uniform row of nearly identical facades, but equally reluctant to confront Karen head-on. About 2 weeks after that HOA meeting, an unsettling incident occurred. Margaret woke one morning, just before dawn, and opened her front door to fetch the newspaper. She nearly toppled over because her hand grabbed for a railing that was no longer there. The entire wooden rail had vanished, leaving behind bare holes where screws once sat. She ventured onto the lawn, heart pounding. There, half buried in the dewy grass, lay her railing, angled awkwardly with screws scattered around it. A few looked broken, as though someone had forcibly wrenched them out. The shock mingled with horror. Who would do something like this, and why? Trembling, Margaret lifted the rail. It wasn't impossibly heavy, but at her age, it was more than a simple chore to move it. Her mind raced with questions. Teenagers pulling a prank? Some petty vandal? It felt too deliberate. She immediately thought of Karen and pushed the notion aside. Surely she wouldn't stoop that low, would she? Margaret called the non-emergency police line to report vandalism. An officer arrived, took a few photos, and filed a report. Without any witnesses or security footage, however, the police couldn't do much. Before leaving, the officer sympathetically suggested Margaret talk to her neighbors or install a door camera. Margaret nodded absently, her mind still reeling. By mid-morning, The news spread like wildfire. Neighbors found Margaret outside, teary-eyed, staring at the dislodged rail on the lawn. Several folks stopped by to see if she needed help. They were appalled. Nobody in Brookstone Oaks had ever witnessed such blatant vandalism aimed at an elderly resident's personal safety. In hushed clusters, they speculated. Some pointed out that Karen had been vocal about streamlining porch designs. Others argued it could have been random troublemakers. But in a place where almost everyone locked their doors at night and streetlights illuminated every cul-de-sac, the latter explanation seemed unlikely. The more they talked, the more they eyed Karen's house with suspicion. Karen, for her part, remained indoors that morning, her blinds drawn. When she did emerge later, she wore large sunglasses and walked briskly to her car, offering no greeting to anyone. Few doubted she'd already heard about the incident. Most expected her to claim ignorance if confronted. But the tension in the air hinted at a different dynamic. For the first time, the community was uniting in outrage, an outrage largely directed at one person. That afternoon, Margaret's closest neighbors, like the Wilsons and the Johansons, helped her drag the broken railing into the garage for safekeeping. The sight of the torn wood and bent screws made Margaret's voice quake with emotion. "I've been here for over 30 years, she said softly, eyes downcast. "I never caused trouble for anyone. Now I'm afraid to walk out my own front door at night." Mrs. Wilson gave Margaret's hand a comforting squeeze. "We'll figure out who did this, and we'll help you get a new railing or repair the old one. You're not alone." The show of support lifted Margaret's spirits, but she couldn't ignore the pang of fear in her chest. Without a railing, she felt unsteady on those porch steps, especially in the dark. The police report was little consolation. She had no choice but to lean on the kindness of her neighbors, or else remain indoors until a safer solution was found. 2 days later, a hastily organized HOA meeting drew an unusually large turnout. The room was abuzz with chatter about Margaret's porch and speculation over who might be responsible. Karen sat at the front, a folder of typed documents on her lap, lips pursed tightly. Rena Delgado, the HOA president, a position above Karen, tapped the microphone. "All right, folks, let's settle down. The main item on the agenda is the vandalism at Ms. Langley's property. This is a serious concern." The hush that fell was tense. Margaret sat near the front, cane resting against her chair. Her face looked drawn and weary. Rena continued, "This behavior is not acceptable in our community. The police report has been filed, and we need to reassure residents that Brookstone Oaks is still a safe place. If anyone has information, please come forward." Heads turned toward Karen. She squared her shoulders. "Let me be clear," she began, voice ringing with indignation. "I absolutely condemn any act of vandalism. The idea that someone might remove a handrail, especially for an elderly resident, is abhorrent. I hope the authorities find whoever is responsible." A snort came from someone in the back row. A few whispered remarks traveled across the room. Karen pressed on. "Now, regarding the style of Ms. Langley's porch, I have indeed noted in the past that some older wooden structures may need updating to maintain property values. That's just a fact. But I would never trespass or forcibly remove any part of her home. Anyone suggesting I'm behind this has no proof." Margaret kept silent, though her gaze flickered from Karen to the floor, as if uncertain how to respond. She had no hard evidence that Karen was the culprit. All she had were rumors, Karen's known dislike of the railing, and the suspicious timing of the entire incident. When a meeting wrapped up, neighbors left feeling unsatisfied. Karen's denial sounded calculated, her words carefully chosen to deflect blame. Some still believed she was guilty, but how could they prove it? Over the following week, the community's mood shifted from shock to resolve. People who had once only nodded politely at each other began having earnest conversations. Mrs. Wilson organized a door-to-door check to see if other residents had experienced tampering. A handful mentioned petty annoyances, a yard decoration missing, a wreath that disappeared from a door, but nothing quite so blatant as Margaret's railing removal. Still, these small accounts added fuel to the suspicion that someone was prowling at night, messing with houses that didn't fit an unseen standard. And while nobody had direct evidence pointing to Karen, they knew her ideology well enough to draw their own conclusions. Margaret, meanwhile, had to rely on a makeshift cane for stability when stepping off her porch. A few neighbors helped her in and out of the house, but it was humiliating for her. She hated feeling dependent. One evening, the Wilsons and the Johansons paid Margaret a visit. They brought along an idea. "We want to replace your old railing with something even sturdier and more beautiful," Mrs. Wilson said. "Everyone's fed up with this intimidation. If we come together, we can contribute funds or labor. We'll make sure you never have to worry about your safety again." Margaret blinked away tears. That's incredibly kind, but I'm on a fixed income. I can't afford to pay for a whole new railing that meets some expensive standard. "We'll organize it," said Mr. Johansson. "Volunteers, donations. The entire community stands behind you. We'll pick a design that's both stylish and HOA compliant. Nobody can object to that." In that moment, Margaret felt a spark of hope and a renewed sense of belonging. The neighbors quickly formed an informal committee to discuss possible railing designs. They took pictures of Margaret's porch, measured the steps, and researched materials that combined classic elegance with modern safety standards. The group leaned toward wrought iron with a simple decorative pattern, a timeless look that would match almost any home exterior. Over cups of coffee in Margaret's living room, the group pored over catalogs and websites. "Look at this one," Mrs. Johansson said, pointing to a sleek iron railing with subtle scrollwork. "It has integrated LED lights, perfect for nighttime." Margaret looked intrigued. "That's certainly beautiful, but won't it be too fancy for someone like me?" "Nonsense," said Mrs. Wilson. "You deserve something as high quality as anyone else here. Plus, if the HOA demands uniformity, an attractive design like this will blend with the broader aesthetic. And with embedded lighting, you'll be much safer going up and down the steps after dark." They decided to get an estimate from a local metalworker known for custom railings. The cost was higher than a standard wooden replacement, but the volunteer committee was determined. They started collecting donations around the neighborhood. People chipped in whatever they could, $50 here, $100 there. Some pledged to help with installation to keep labor costs down. Karen soon caught wind of this plan. She sent a mass email reminding residents that any exterior modifications required HOA approval prior to installation. The new railing for Margaret committee, however, was prepared. They filed the necessary request form, including sketches of the proposed design, along with a note emphasizing the safety aspect. Officially, the design fell well within city code and only needed a nod from the HOA board. A special HOA board meeting convened to review the request. Karen, as secretary, insisted on leading the discussion. "While we are all sympathetic to Ms. Langley's predicament," she began, "we must ensure that the design chosen is not overly elaborate or in conflict with Brookstone Oak's established aesthetic guidelines." Rena Delgado rolled her eyes discreetly before responding. "The design is fairly neutral. A black wrought iron railing with minimal scrollwork and built-in lighting for safety. It's certainly not outlandish." Karen scanned a printed copy of the design plan. "I note that the ornamental pattern is somewhat intricate. Brookstone Oaks aims for a cohesive appearance. If every homeowner starts installing wrought iron railings with custom flourishes, we risk losing our uniform facade." Thomas Kim, another board member, coughed. "I'd argue that a little variation is a good thing. Besides, we have no official rule banning wrought iron. The existing guidelines only mention that railing replacements should be in keeping with the home's architectural style and harmonious with the neighborhood's overall look." A heated debate ensued. Karen kept citing intangible aesthetic concerns, while the other board members pointed to practicality and the basic right to safety. Finally, they took a vote. The result: 4 in favor, 1 abstention. Karen. Approval granted. Karen's face tightened. She scribbled notes in her folder, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Outside in the hallway, she murmured to Rena, "Mark my words, this sets a precedent that might open the door for all sorts of design chaos." Rena retorted quietly, "It's a railing for an elderly woman who got vandalized. A little empathy, Bernice. Karen only turned away, shoulders stiff. With official HOA approval secured, the community wasted no time commissioning the railing. The local artisan, Mark Tennyson, arrived one bright morning with his truck loaded with tools and prefabricated sections of wrought iron. A handful of neighbors gathered on Margaret's driveway, chatting excitedly as Mark unpacked the pieces. Margaret stepped out slowly, cane in hand. She peered at the black metal gleaming in the sunlight. "It's lovely," she whispered, her eyes misty. "I never expected something so elegant." Mrs. Wilson patted Margaret's shoulder. "You deserve it. And you'll see. This is going to look incredible once installed." Mark worked diligently, measuring the porch step angles, drilling secure anchor points, and methodically fitting each wrought iron section. The final piece included a curved top rail and a few modest scrolls, decorative yet not gaudy. Tiny LED lights were discreetly embedded along the underside of the railing, casting just enough illumination to see the steps clearly at night. By mid-afternoon, the job was nearly done. Curious neighbors stopped by to watch or lend a hand with passing tools. A sense of unity filled the air. People who had barely spoken to each other before now chatted amiably, united in a shared mission to help Margaret. When Mark completed the last weld and turned on the embedded lights, the crowd applauded. Margaret, tears in her eyes, ascended and descended the porch steps with a newfound confidence. The rail felt smooth under her grip, the LED lights warm without being harsh. "That's perfect," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. "Thank you, all of you." Smiles broke out on every face. For a moment, Brookstone Oaks felt like the friendliest place on earth. Neighbors rallying around one of their own, forging a bond through shared compassion. Some snapped photos of Margaret standing by her new railing, intending to post them on the neighborhood's social media page as a testament to what cooperation could achieve. Evening fell, and the soft glow from Margaret's porch lights melded with the warm LEDs under the handrail, creating a gentle ambience. Passers-by could see the silhouette of the iron scrollwork from the road, beautiful and unmissable. Karen observed these events from a distance, a storm brewing inside her. She drove by Margaret's house under the pretense of checking mailboxes for compliance, and found a small crowd admiring the new installation. None of them waved her over or acknowledged her presence. She felt conspicuously excluded. As she slowed her car, Karen took in the sight. The wrought iron railing, with its delicate patterns and subtle lights, was undeniably attractive, yet it represented everything she disliked about unregulated individual style. To her, it broke the uniform monotony she valued so highly. She noticed the positivity emanating from the group, heard their laughter and conversation, and felt a strange pang in her chest. Part of her yearned for acceptance, but her pride insisted she double down on her aesthetic convictions. She drove off without a word, leaving the celebration behind. That night, she drafted another email to the HOA board, complaining that excessive ornamentation might start creeping into the neighborhood if they didn't review or tighten guidelines. Before hitting send, she hesitated. Her standing in the HOA had taken a blow due to the widespread suspicion about the porch vandalism. Another complaint so soon might only worsen her reputation. In the end, she pressed send anyway. Word of Margaret's new, HOA-approved railing spread quickly. Most neighbors were thrilled, seeing it as a heartwarming story of communal solidarity in the face of petty vandalism. But a few, aligned with Karen's strict minimalism, murmured objections in private. They lamented that, once you allow any ornate design, next thing you know, everyone's upgrading with flamboyant fixtures. Still, they were a small minority. The majority admired the improvements. Margaret, for her part, felt more secure than she had in weeks. No longer did she dread stepping outside. She even allowed herself to enjoy the luminous glow on her porch at dusk, thinking of how it might have made Robert smile, knowing she was safe. As summer turned to autumn, Karen found her influence waning. The violent act against Margaret's railing, though officially unsolved, had become a permanent stain on Karen's perceived integrity. At board meetings, she discovered that her suggestions were met with greater skepticism, her motions second-guessed. Meanwhile, the new community spirit thrived. The same volunteer team that had helped Margaret began to tackle other small neighborhood projects, fixing the sign at the entrance, planting flowers near the common mailbox area. They organized a bake sale, with proceeds going to a fund for any future property repairs needed by elderly or disabled residents. Every event saw Karen on the outside looking in. Invitations to gatherings had stopped. Children no longer waved at her from driveways. Some neighbors openly avoided her presence on the sidewalk. For all her devotion to preserving property values, she'd lost the intangible sense of camaraderie that held Brookstone Oaks together. Desperate to regain control, Karen combed through the HOA covenant, searching for any obscure clause that might invalidate Margaret's new railing. She found a line stating that modifications must remain in harmony with the color scheme of the property. She claimed the black wrought iron clashed with Margaret's white porch, thus was out of harmony. She brought this complaint to Rena Delgado, who responded with a flat stare. "Karen, we already approved it unanimously. The city code is satisfied. The design is tasteful. This is done." Karen pressed on, but the black stands out starkly against the white siding. It's not minimal, there are decorative scrolls. The guidelines are very explicit that. "Stop," Rena cut her off. "Sometimes it's best to let this go. The railing is safe, fully installed, and you know how the community feels about it. If you want to push your complaint further, you'll need majority board approval. And I can already tell you, that won't happen." Realizing she was out of moves, Karen left the meeting in a huff, feeling impotent rage and humiliation. Several months later came the annual HOA board elections. Normally, these were sleepy affairs. Positions were uncontested, and incumbents were re-elected without fuss. This year, however, a wave of new candidates emerged, inspired by the fiasco around Margaret's railing. Their platform championed transparency, empathy, and a more balanced approach to community standards. Karen initially thought her seat as secretary was safe, given her experience. But the memory of the vandalism had not faded. On election night, the votes were tallied in the community clubhouse. Karen lost her seat to a retired teacher named Deborah Klein, who had never been on the board before but was well-liked around the neighborhood. When the results were announced, polite applause filled the room, polite but charged with relief. Karen stood off to the side, arms folded, watching her influence slip away. She realized that, in trying to exert total control, she had alienated the very people whose trust she needed. Without her official HOA role, Karen's presence in Brookstone Oaks became diminished. She was still a resident, of course, and would occasionally file nuisance complaints about a neighbor's fence height or a dog barking. But with Deborah as secretary and Rena still as president, those complaints rarely gained traction unless they had merit. Freed from Karen's constant scrutiny, neighbors experimented with subtle personal touches, pastel paint for shutters, small bird baths, or unique front door wreaths. The overall effect was a patchwork of individual styles that still felt cohesive, each home reflecting its owner's character. Margaret's house, with its well-lit iron railing, remained a beacon of how a caring community could triumph over intimidation. She had begun greeting neighbors again with a restored sense of belonging, and they, in turn, looked out for her. Sometimes, children helped bring her mail up to the porch, leaning on that elegant iron rail as they chatted with her about school or summer camp. Snow fell one December evening, blanketing Brookstone Oaks in a pristine sheet of white. Margaret watched from her front window as the LEDs in her railing illuminated the steps, their glow reflecting softly off the fresh snow. She felt grateful. Despite the turmoil and the fear she'd endured, she recognized that so much good had ultimately come from it. Across the street, Karen sat in her own home, peering through slats in the blinds. She, too, saw the gentle glow of Margaret's porch, the swirl of iron dusted with snow. An unexpected pang of regret flickered in her chest, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that her efforts to impose uniformity had not only failed but backfired. In her quest to enforce an austere vision, she had galvanized the entire neighborhood against her. She still nursed a stubborn resentment. Yet late at night, sometimes Karen found herself wondering how things might have turned out if she had approached the community differently, if she had collaborated with neighbors instead of confronting them. That question haunted her, lingering in the silent rooms of her perfectly curated home. When winter thawed and spring arrived, Brookstone Oaks burst back to life with blossoming azaleas and dogwood trees. Birds sang from rooftops, kids resumed their sidewalk games, and neighbors resumed evening strolls. Under new HOA leadership, the atmosphere lightened. Rules remained, but their enforcement became more transparent and cooperative. Margaret's garden, once limited to begonias, now expanded with new blooms. Encouraged by neighbors, she planted lavender and roses, framing her porch in lush greenery. The iron railing, far from looking out of place, blended in gracefully with the growing foliage. At night, the soft lights still provided sure footing for Margaret, and a welcoming sight for visitors. Periodically, people would mention how this small porch had become a symbol of resilience and unity. Margaret would smile at that, brushing the idea away. She insisted she was just an old lady needing a handrail. But deep down, she cherished the sense of belonging that had blossomed from her ordeal. Though Karen rarely joined neighborhood functions now, she occasionally passed by these gatherings, returning from errands or strolling at dusk. She observed from a distance the block party with barbecues, the lemonade stands run by enthusiastic kids, the older couples relaxing on lawn chairs. Gone was the tension of her presence. People were at ease, enjoying their own yards without fear of a violation letter. A curious wave of loneliness washed over Karen. She had once imagined that enforcing rules would earn her respect, a sort of guardianship of the neighborhood. Instead, she'd become the antagonist, pitted at best, scorned at worst. One weekend, she decided to approach Margaret's porch. It was midday, and Margaret was tending to her plants. Karen cleared her throat. "Hello, Ms. Langley." Margaret turned, smiling politely but with a hint of wariness. "Bernice, hello." Karen gazed at the railing. "I see you added some new plants. It looks nice. And the railing, I suppose it's proven useful." Margaret nodded. "Very much so. I'm grateful for everyone who helped me get it. It's made a big difference." An awkward silence settled. Karen shifted on her feet, as though tempted to say something more. Perhaps an apology. But the words never came. She simply muttered a curt, "Have a good day," and walked off. Margaret watched her retreat, both relieved and puzzled. She sensed a conflict within Karen, a desire to reconcile warring with her pride. In the following weeks, Karen kept a low profile. She refrained from sending petty complaints to the new HOA board. Some neighbors remarked that maybe she'd softened. Others shrugged, pointing out that her abrupt midnight sabotage of the wooden rail was never officially resolved. "I doubt she'll ever admit to it," said Mr. Johansson one afternoon while chatting with the Wilsons. But the important thing is the neighborhoods moved on. And indeed, that seemed to be the case. People had reclaimed the sense of community they'd feared lost. Karen's name only came up occasionally, usually followed by a resigned shrug or a wry joke. The rail on Margaret's porch had become the emblem of a communal stand against intimidation. Yet, sometimes, Margaret thought about the night her rail was removed. She replayed the sequence of events, imagining Karen creeping through the darkness, unscrewing bolts. The knowledge made her uneasy, but she resolved not to dwell on it. Her new motto was, "Look how far we've come." Dwelling on bitterness would only poison the happiness she'd found in the aftermath. Late one evening, Margaret sat in her rocking chair, the LEDs casting a gentle glow around her feet. A warm breeze rustled the leaves of her newly planted rose bushes. She sipped chamomile tea, reflecting on the roller coaster of the past few months. The memory of her old wooden railing still stirred a pang of nostalgia. Robert had built it with love. But she took solace in knowing that, had that old rail never been vandalized, she might not have experienced the outpouring of neighborly support that gave her renewed faith in community. Across the street, Karen's house stood dark, its interior lights off except for a faint glow in the living room. Perhaps Karen was awake, reading by lamplight or scrolling through her phone. Margaret allowed herself a brief, empathetic thought. I hope she finds peace in all this. As for Brookstone Oaks, it carried on, season by season. The subtle changes, personal touches on homes, a more compassionate HOA, and newly forged friendships made the neighborhood more vibrant and welcoming than ever. The tyranny of uniformity had given way to a quiet acceptance of individuality, bound together by kindness and mutual respect. In the end, Karen's act of sabotage backfired spectacularly, leaving Margaret with a safer, lovelier porch and the neighborhood with a stronger bond. Though the culprit was never formally charged, the moral victory belonged to the collective will of Brookstone Oaks. And there, on that porch with a wrought iron railing, Margaret quietly celebrated the triumph of unity over fear, lighting the way for anyone who might need a steady hand in the dark.